He has been called many things.
He was the savior of Rwanda.
Every one of the elections that he ran, those who opposed him went to prison. And their supporters have been arrested, tortured, many of them killed.
But who is this guy really?
I grew up in Uganda in a refugee camp.
It was April 1994. This small landlocked country in East Africa, known as the land of 1,000 hills, was about to experience a horror beyond imagination. The assassination of President Jude led to one of the darkest moments in the history of Rwanda. Within hours of his death, the streets of Kigali, the capital, were filled with roadblocks. Armed militias known as the Interahamwe took to the streets with machetes in hand, as if they had been waiting for this moment. In the 100 brutal days that followed, over 800,000 men, women and children were brutally murdered. Tutsi families were dragged from their homes and slaughtered. Hutus who refused to join the killings were killed as well. Streets that were once busy with life became scenes of unspeakable horror. Now, amidst this chaos, rose a certain 36-year-old man, leading a group called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. They charged into the heart of the genocide. With a vision of a Rwanda that could rise from the ashes, they declared war on the perpetrators, pushing them far into exile. It's been more than 30 years since this war, and Rwanda has changed beyond recognition. The streets, once covered in blood, are now lined with green trees and modern buildings. Rwanda is now called the Singapore of Africa, a paradise for tourists built by the steady and strong hands of this man, Paul Kagame, the 36-year-old who led the fight against the Rwandan genocide more than 30 years ago. To some, Paul Kagame is a hero, a visionary leader who defied all odds to rebuild a nation that was once broken. However, in recent years, the tune seems to have changed for this man. After about 25 years in power, voices of dissent are beginning to grow louder. Voices that believe Kagame to be just another ruthless authoritarian figure, silencing opposition voices at home and destabilizing other governments abroad. His leadership has sparked global debate, leaving the world to wonder, is he still the savior the people grew to love? Or has he morphed into a brutal dictator clinging on to power? I want to tell you the story of how a young refugee boy became one of the most powerful leaders in Africa, and how his regime is shaping the destiny of Rwanda's giant neighbors, who are growing increasingly worried about his influence in the Great Lakes region. This is the story of Paul Kagame, the mystery man of Rwanda.
The press, human rights groups, what they say about me personally prove me guilty.
To understand the complicated history of Rwanda that led to the unfortunate events of 1994, we first need to go back in time to centuries ago, before Rwanda was even a country. A long time ago, three groups of people lived together in this land: the Twa, the Hutu, and the Tutsi. Historians believe the Twa were the first to arrive, living in the forest as hunters. The Hutu came next, between the 5th and 11th centuries, settling as farmers. Much later, in the 14th century, the Tutsi arrived. They were cattle herders and warriors who eventually took control of the land, creating a system called Obohake. Sorry if I murdered the name. Where Hutu farmers worked for the Tutsi in exchange for land and cattle. But over time, this system became unfair, with the Tutsi holding most of the power while the Hutu were treated as second-class citizens. By the time the 19th century rolled around, European explorers had arrived, with Rwanda now caught between three European powers: the Germans, the Belgians, and of course the British, who were all fighting for control. Then in 1885, at the Berlin Conference, European powers divided Africa amongst themselves. Rwanda and its neighbor Burundi were given to Germany. During the German rule, nothing changed much in Rwanda. They let the Tutsi leaders stay in power and forced Hutu chiefs in the north to obey them. But during World War I, Germany lost Rwanda and Burundi to Belgium, and this was when things began to change. At first, The Belgians continued to rule through the Tutsis, but later they reduced the Mwami's power and changed the Obohaki system. By 1952, the Belgians felt something was still missing, so they introduced political reforms. But instead of bringing peace, it sort of made things worse. The Tutsi were favored and left to control the government, while the Hutu were left in lower positions. The colonizers also spread the belief that the Tutsi were superior to the Hutu, treating them as if they were from different races. Now, before colonial rule, these groups weren't so fixed as someone could change their status over time based on wealth or marriage. But the Belgians made sure it became permanent by creating identity cards labeling people as Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa, setting the stage for future violence. By November 1959, a violent incident sparked a Hutu uprising in which hundreds of Tutsis were killed and thousands were forced to flee to neighboring countries. This marks the beginning of the Hutu peasant revolution, which lasted until 1961. By the time Rwanda became independent in 1962, about 120,000 Tutsis had fled to neighboring countries seeking safety from the Hutu who were now in power. Among them was this 2-year-old boy named Paul Kagame. Born in October 1957 in a small village called Tambwe, Paul Kagame was the youngest of 6 children in a Tutsi family. His family had royal connections, but that did not save them from the violence. They went to the northeast of Rwanda, where they reunited with Kagame's father, who soon realized that nowhere in Rwanda was truly safe. So he decided to take his family into Uganda. Life in Uganda was hard. Kagame and his family settled in the Shungerezi refugee camp. The Rwandan refugees, known as the 59ers, were outsiders. They had lost their country, their homes, and their identity. But at the camp, Kagame met a boy who would change his life forever. Frederick family had also fled Rwanda in the heat of the Hutu peasant revolution. The two boys soon became inseparable. They explored the camp together, listening to older refugees tell stories about their homeland. Stories that began to instill some form of drive in them. From here, the boys started dreaming of maybe one day going back to Rwanda. But first, they needed to get educated. Kagame was enrolled in a small school near the refugee camp, an outdoor space where children sat on the ground to learn. But being a smart kid, he didn't remain there for long. He worked hard and was eventually accepted into Rengoro Primary School, where he walked 10 miles every day to school. These early challenges didn't stop Kagame from being top of his class, earning the highest grades in the district. However, being a refugee meant he had a glass ceiling. First, he wasn't allowed Ugandan citizenship, which meant he couldn't get a scholarship for secondary education. But the universe was working overtime to make sure Kagame got the best of whatever he desired. And just like that, a family friend from Belgium decided to step in, taking full responsibilities of Kagame's education. But the good fortune he enjoyed didn't erase the feeling of being treated like an outsider from the mind of Kagame. The stories his father told him about why he and many others were forced to leave their country, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because of who they were, sparked a strong desire in him to fight for freedom. But before he could be ready for that fight, a great tragedy befell him and his family, and soon, young Kagame was facing an uphill battle to salvage what was left of his future. At the young age of 15, Kagame lost his father. Around the same time, his closest friend Fred Rwigema disappeared, leaving the boy all alone. His new situation left him angry most of the time. Soon, Kagame started getting into fights at school, defending himself and other Rwandan children against Ugandan students who insulted them. He eventually got expelled from the school, having to complete his studies at Old Kampala Secondary School in 1976. But all these distractions he had to deal with meant his grades weren't so great anymore. Being a refugee boy, this made his future even more uncertain. After graduating, Kagame tried to find opportunities, but none came. He was told about scholarships to study in Switzerland, but no one would help him get one. And so he began a journey of self-discovery. First, he needed travel documents to go visit his roots. Kagame had lived outside Rwanda since he was 2 years old. He had no memories of his homeland except the story of how his family had escaped to Uganda. And like many refugees, he had no passport. Rwanda didn't recognize him and Uganda wouldn't make him a citizen. But in 1977, Kagame convinced a Ugandan official to give him a special travel document. With that, he crossed the border into Rwanda for the first time since he was a child. Kagame had entered Rwanda legally, but his documents didn't show he was Rwandan. He was afraid the police might stop him. And so, he only went out at night, walking through the city he had only heard about in stories. Those visits opened his eyes. He saw how the country was divided along tribal lines and how Tutsi people like him were treated unfairly. This only made him more angry. But something else happened too. As he embarked on this journey of self-discovery, he began to develop a deep interest in intelligence gathering. He read spy novels and admired revolutionaries like Che Guevara. Then, one day, he heard the surprising news that his childhood friend Fred Rwigema was looking for him. This was in fact a pleasant surprise, and when the two met, Fred had a thrilling story to tell him. It turns out that Fred had joined a rebel group in Uganda led by Yoweri Museveni, a man fighting to overthrow the brutal dictator Idi Amin. Fred had trained in Tanzania, became a soldier, and was now part of a real revolution. This transformation story inspired Kagame. If Fred could learn to fight for a cause, why couldn't he? Kagame and other Rwandan exiles decided they needed military skills if they ever wanted to return home. And then, the opportunity came. In 1981, Kagame and Fred joined Museveni's National Resistance Army, a small but determined rebel group to fight Uganda's dictator. Over the next 5 years, the rebels fought a brutal war against the Ugandan government in the Ugandan Bush War. As the war in Uganda continued, Kagame became an expert in intelligence. He was quiet, observant, and strategic. He rose in rank, becoming one of Museveni's trusted officers. He survived battles, hunger, and harsh weather conditions. Museveni finally won and took power in Uganda in 1986. Kagame and his comrades, now experienced soldiers, held key positions in the new government. But Kagame's mind wasn't on Uganda. This wasn't the goal, just a distraction. He was thinking about Rwanda. If they could win here, why couldn't they do it back home? In 1988, Rwandan refugees in Uganda, many of whom had served in President Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army, which had overthrown the previous Ugandan government in 1986, formed a secret group to push for their right to return home. They created the Rwandan Refugee Welfare Foundation, which would later become the Rwandan Patriotic Front. By 1989, Kagame's role in Uganda was becoming sort of complicated. The Ugandan government was getting nervous about the Rwandan exiles in their army. Museveni's government was said to be worried of the potential of these exiles launching an attack against the government of Rwanda from within Uganda. These concerns led to Kagame being sent away from the government. He was sent to the United States Army Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, one of the most prestigious military schools in the world. And right there, he studied war strategy, intelligence, and leadership. But he never stopped thinking about Rwanda. He kept in touch with Fred, who had taken the leadership of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the rebel group formed by the Rwandans in exile. Together, they planned their next move. It was a quiet morning on October 1st, 1990, when a group of armed men of the Rwandan Patriotic Front crossed a small bridge into Rwanda. The timing of the attack was no accident. The leaders of both Uganda and Rwanda were away at a United Nations meeting in New York. With both presidents out of their countries, the rebels saw their chance and they took it. On the night before the invasion, trucks full of soldiers rolled into a district near the Rwandan border. The soldiers were dressed for war, carrying powerful weapons including machine guns and rocket launchers. they were ready. Around 10 a.m. on October 1st, about 2,000 rebels along with 800 civilians acting as medics and messengers crossed the border into Rwanda, determined to take back their homeland. They moved quickly, taking over the border post at Kagitumba and pushing deeper and deeper into the country. Leading them was Fred Rwigema, a man many of them admired and trusted. He had fought in wars before and was known for his courage. But one important man was missing from this invasion: Paul Kagame. He wasn't in Rwanda. He wasn't even in Africa at the time. He was still some thousands of miles away in the United States, studying at a military school in Kansas. However, this didn't stop the rebels from proceeding with the plan. At first, everything went smoothly. They quickly took over military posts, captured small towns, and even convinced some locals to join them. By the end of the first day, they had captured the town of Gabiro, a regional capital. This felt like a victory. But then, disaster struck. On the second day of the invasion, Fred Rwigema was killed. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened. Some say it was an accident, others believed it was murder. But what mattered was that their leader was gone. Losing a commander so early in a war was like a ship losing its captain in a storm. Panic quickly spread in the camp. Some rebels ran back to Uganda. Others, shocked and heartbroken, stayed, but they all lost hope in this fight. The dream of reclaiming Rwanda seemed to be over before it even started. Back in Kansas, Kagame received the devastating news. He knew the rebellion was collapsing, and without hesitation, he returned to Africa, arriving at the battlefield to find his comrades disorganized and losing hope. But Kagame was not a man to give up. He quickly changed their tactics, adopting guerrilla warfare. He led his fighters into the harsh Virunga Mountains, where they survived under brutal conditions. They had little food, no medicine, and freezing nights. But Kagame reminded them of their mission. He told them of how Museveni's rebels, who had once been just a small group, had fought and won. If they could do it, Kagame said, so can we. 3 months later, the RPF struck again. On January 22, 1991, 700 fighters crept down from the mountains towards a government stronghold in Ruhengeri. Guided by locals, they moved silently through the darkness, and as the sun rose, they attacked. The government forces in Ruhengeri were caught completely off guard. Some tried to fight back, but they were unprepared. Within hours, the rebels had taken control of the town. President Habyarimana and his close circle, known as the Akazu, were humiliated and responded with a brutal force. Government soldiers and militias stormed into villages, targeting Tutsi civilians. Hundreds of them were killed. The government blamed the rebels for the violence, but in reality, it was the government forces carrying out these massacres. As the war raged on, Rwanda's government became more desperate and turned to France for more weapons and military support. France, seeing Rwanda as part of their influence in Africa and fearing they would lose control over Rwanda, sent help. Kagame and his rebels kept fighting as more people joined them, including some Hutu politicians who turned against the government. The RPF welcomed them, proving they were not just fighting for the Tutsis, but for all Rwandans. By June 1992, as Rwandan civil war continued, Paul Kagame declared a ceasefire and agreed to meet with the Rwandan government in Arusha, Tanzania, for peace talks. This was a tense moment, as bitter enemies were now sitting across the table trying to build a government together. 13 months later, in August 1993, they signed the Arusha Accords. The agreement promised a shared government, equal power between the rebels and the ruling party. They also promised the return of refugees. This seemed like Rwanda had a chance for peace. Unfortunately though, not everyone wanted peace. The CDR, a radical Hutu party that had spent years spreading fear and hate against the Tutsis, had been left out of the new government entirely. And for this, they were furious and vowed revenge. As soon as the accords were signed, the CDR struck back, calling for a national uprising and labeling anyone who supported the peace deal a traitor. Soon enough, riots exploded across Kigali, and for 6 days, militants roamed the streets, chanting slogans and killing hundreds of Tutsis. while the streets burned, Rwanda's ruling elite intensified the war by creating a Hutu power radio station. This Hutu radio in mid-1993 spread hate-filled speeches against the Tutsis, such as, quote, the Hutu 10 Commandments and calling for their extermination. Despite all of this, the outside world ignored all the warning signs. In 1993, the United States even called its relationship with Rwanda, quote, excellent, and claimed there was no evidence of systematic human rights abuses. But inside Rwanda, the story was different. By early 1994, political assassinations, riots, and violent attacks became daily occurrences. Roadblocks appeared throughout the country. The hate radio broadcast grew more extreme. 3 times Rwandan's leaders tried to launch the new government, and 3 times they failed. In the months and weeks leading up to the genocide, the government took delivery of hundreds of thousands of shipments from China. Unknown to the general public, the shipments contained machetes, axes, and other weapons disguised as farming tools. The deals were brokered through the Rwandan embassy in Paris. Soon, there were enough machetes to arm every 3rd adult male in the country. There was some bit of unease in the air. And then, it happened. On April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana flew to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania for a meeting with regional leaders. That night, as he was flying back to Rwanda in his plane, along with Burundi's President Cyprien Ntaryamira, 2 missiles shot through the skies, both hitting the plane as it got closer to the airport. It exploded in the air and crashed into the garden of Habyarimana's house. No one knew for sure who shot those missiles, but some blamed Kagame and his fighters. Others said it was Hutu leaders who thought Habyarimana was too weak to stop the peace process. But in the end, it didn't matter, because what happened next would become one of the worst tragedies in history. In less than an hour, roadblocks appeared all over Kigali. The genocide had begun. As news of Habyarimana's death spread, the hate radio station RTLM went into overdrive. Quote, the Tutsis have killed our president, they announced. Now is the time to finish the Tutsi cockroaches, the announcer said. The killing started almost immediately. The presidential guard hunted down Hutu politicians who had supported peace, and one by one, they were all killed. By noon on April 7th, mobs were roaming the streets with machetes and guns, searching for anyone with an identity card that marked them as Tutsis. Families were dragged from their homes. Women and children were not left out. Paul Kagame had hoped for peace, but now, seeing the genocide unfold, he soon realized that there was one option left: to fight back. He warned the United Nations that if the killings didn't stop, he would tell his soldiers to attack the capital in Kigali. He even offered to work with the UN peacekeepers to stop the massacres, but his offer was ignored. Meanwhile, the death toll kept rising. In the first 24 hours, 6,000 people were killed. Within the next 3 days, the number had climbed to 20,000. Tutsi families tried to hide. Some locked themselves in their homes, but the killers soon found them out. Others ran to the forest and marshes, but nowhere in Rwanda was truly safe. Kagame and his fighters fought bravely and tirelessly to take back Rwanda and stop the genocide. They moved fast, attacking government forces and pushing toward Kigali. By June, half of his army was surrounding Kigali. But not everyone wanted him to win. Remember the French, these guys. The French, who had supported Rwanda's government for years, didn't want to see the RPF take over. In June, they sent troops under the excuse of humanitarian mission, but their real goal was to protect the government forces that were carrying out this massacre. Despite these efforts, Kagame's fighters kept advancing, and on July 4th, 1994, they entered Kigali. The government's forces fled. 2 weeks later, the RPF took control and declared victory. The genocide was over, but the country was in ruins, shattered and scattered by the horror that had unfolded. The battle was won, but the war was not. It was time to rebuild. Paul Kagame, now 36 years old, became the Minister of Defense and Vice President. Pastor Bizimungu, a Hutu, was made president to give the impression of a balanced government, but the real power remained with Kagame and the Rwandan Patriotic Front. The new government faced huge challenges. The country was broken, and many leaders didn't even have offices, equipment, or money. At the same time, the defeated Rwandan army and Interahamwe militia had escaped to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and were preparing to fight back. Kagame, now in charge of defending Rwanda, had to act quickly. First, he asked the UN to disarm the camps and move them far away from the border, but nothing was done. The US, led by Ambassador Meddling, blocked efforts to control the camps. This left Kagame more frustrated, and he had to deal with the threat on his own. Inside Rwanda, tensions remained high. Some RPF soldiers who returned home found that their families had been wiped out. In anger, some took revenge on those they believed were responsible. Kagame immediately ordered the arrest of said soldiers who carried out revenge killing, but he didn't do enough to stop them. The genocide had left deep scars, and understandably so. To handle the huge number of people accused of genocide, Rwanda created a special justice system. These courts aimed to punish the guilty, but also help communities heal from this trauma. But as the healing process began, Kagame was also fighting another battle to make sure Rwanda never experienced this horror again. After years of pleading with world leaders to help deal with the enemy camps on the border of Rwanda, and no action was taken, in 1996, Kagame decided to take matters into his own hands. He launched a military campaign to destroy the camps and bring the refugees back to Rwanda. This operation was also aimed at overthrowing Zaire's leader, Mobutu Sese Seko, who had supported the genociders. Kagame believed that as long as Mobutu was in power, Rwanda would never truly be safe. And so, working with Uganda's president, Yoweri Museveni, Kagame helped rebels led by Laurent Desire Kabila marched across the country in what became known as the First Congo War, which lasted between 1996 to 1997. The rebels overthrew Mobutu, and Kabila became the new leader of Zaire, which was later renamed the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Over 1 million refugees returned back home to Rwanda. However, Kagame's methods drew criticism, with some calling it forced repatriation. Now, as Kagame began facing his first real critics, he discovered that his influence over Kabila was beginning to wane. In 1998, Kabila turned against his Rwandan allies and kicked them out. Kagame, furious that Kabila was now supporting Rwandan rebels, backed a new rebellion and invaded the Congo yet again. This time, the war was much bigger, leading to bloody battles over Congo's rich resources, and the Second Congo War began. Kagame was determined to eliminate the remaining threats to Rwanda, but his actions in Congo sparked international outrage. His troops were accused of massacres, and hundreds of thousands of refugees went missing. Despite the controversy, however, Kagame turned a deaf ear. Back home, he focused his attention on the future of Rwanda. But to do this, he needed to take over the country and rule it by himself. And that was what happened in the year 2000. In the year 2000, under mysterious circumstances, President Bizimungu resigned and Kagame became the acting president. Under Kagame's leadership, Rwanda focused on rebuilding and development. His government launched Vision 2020, a plan to transform Rwanda into a middle-income country. They improved schools, roads, healthcare, and promoted gender equality. Rwanda also cracked down on corruption and introduced strict rules to maintain order, including banning plastic bags and outlawing traditional brick making to protect the environment. The government's approach was authoritarian, but it brought stability and economic growth, so no one cared, at least not immediately. But then, things quickly began to change. Kagame started to show more and more of his ruthless side. Many survivors of the 1994 genocide had seen Paul Kagame as the nation's savior, a man who lifted the country from the ashes. But by 2003, as Rwandan people prepared for its first post-genocide presidential election, they began to notice something disturbing. People spoke in whispers. Political debates disappeared from cafes and other public places. Journalists who questioned Kagame's leadership were either jailed or vanished. The dictatorship had begun. When the 2003 election approached, many hoped it would be a step toward true democracy. But Kagame had no intention of allowing real competition. His main challenger, Faustin Twagiramungu, was an outspoken critic. He had returned from exile to run against Kagame. But he soon found his campaign struggling to survive as it was strangled by intimidation. Rwandans who supported him were harassed, and state-controlled media vilified him as a threat to national unity. Another opposition figure, Alphonse Kanyarengwe, who had joined the RPF but later fell out of favor, died under mysterious circumstances in 2003. His death, just like many others, raised suspicions. Twagiramungu, realizing he had no real chance, left Rwanda again after losing the election in a landslide. And then came 2010. Kagame was running for re-election, but this time the opposition was even weaker. Victor Ingabire, a Rwandan politician who had lived in exile in the Netherlands, returned home to challenge him. She called for greater political freedom and for recognizing all victims of the genocide, including the Hutus who had been massacred by the RPF in revenge killings. But this was enough to seal her fate. She was arrested on charges of genocide ideology and, quote, terrorism. The trial was widely condemned as politically motivated. Ingabire was sentenced to 15 years in prison, a clear warning to anyone who dared to challenge Kagame's rule. Meanwhile, other opposition leaders, Andre Kagwa, the vice president of the opposition Green Party, was found dead, his body nearly decapitated. Jean-Leonard Rugambage, a journalist who was investigating this murder, was gunned down in front of his own house. 2010 became almost like a year of disappearance for the opposition and dissenting voices. Even those who ran away weren't so safe. In South Africa, Patrick Karegeya, a former intelligence chief who had fallen out with Kagame, was found strangled in a hotel room. His close ally, General Kayumba, survived multiple assassination attempts in Johannesburg. South African intelligence directly implicated Kagame's government in this killing. Yet, Rwandan's response was chilling. Officials openly mocked Karegeya's death, with Kagame himself warning that, quote, anyone who betrays our cause will pay the price. As Kagame's second term neared its end, Rwandans prepared for what they thought would be a transition. But instead, a constitutional referendum was held in 2015 with a suspicious 98% approval, allowing him to run yet again. In 2017, Kagame won 99% of the vote, and a third result even by authoritarian standards. Anyone who might have challenged him had been silenced. Diane Rwigara, a young businesswoman, tried to run against him. She was arrested on trumped-up charges of tax evasion and, quote, inciting insurrection. Her mother and sisters were also detained. Meanwhile, Kagame's security forces kidnapped and executed political opponents, as reported by Human Rights Watch. By 2021, Kagame's rule was absolute. Journalists continued to disappear. Keshian Namuhanga, a reporter, vanished in Mozambique, presumably kidnapped by Rwandan agents. Yvonne Idamange, a YouTuber who criticized Kagame, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Even former Kagame allies weren't safe. Paul Rusesabagina, the hero of Hotel Rwanda, was lured into a trap and kidnapped from Dubai in 2020. He was then imprisoned on charges of terrorism in a trial condemned worldwide as politically motivated. Kagame had gone full dictator mode, but no one could challenge him. And his influence was not only at home, he was meddling in the affairs of other countries as well, especially his giant neighbor, the Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2009, a picture made rounds in the international media. Paul Kagame and Joseph Kabila shaking hands in Goma, Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. This was supposed to symbolize the end of hostilities between Rwanda and the DRC. But behind the political smiles, Kagame had already planted the seeds of chaos in the mineral-rich region. For over a decade, Kagame had been accused of backing militias in the DRC, fueling a crisis that cost thousands of lives. The early 2000s were supposed to bring peace to the Great Lakes region. The Rwandan army had officially withdrawn from the DRC in 2002 after years of occupying eastern Congo, but their influence remained. Kagame's government claimed to be defending Rwanda from a Hutu rebel group with ties to the perpetrators of the 1994 genocide. But in reality, Rwanda's involvement was about something else: minerals and control. By 2004, Laurent Nkunda, a Congolese Tutsi general, broke away from the Congolese army and formed a rebel group known as the National Congress for the Defense of the People. Nkunda justified his rebellion by claiming he was protecting Congolese Tutsis from persecution. But investigation by the United Nations and human rights organizations exposed the CNDP's deep ties to Kagame's regime. Nkunda's fighters launched deadly attacks in eastern Congo, killing civilians and seizing mineral-rich areas. Rwanda's government denied any involvement, but reports surfaced showing that the CNDP received direct military and logistical support from Kigali. As this rebel group continued to destabilize the DRC, Rwanda continued to profit from smuggled Congolese minerals, and the West largely turned a blind eye. Kagame was seen as a strategic ally, a leader who had rebuilt Rwanda and maintained stability. His government continued to receive billions in aid from the United States and the United Kingdom. Even the European Union was in on this. No one wanted to admit that he was fueling a war next door. But in 2009, the situation became way too obvious to ignore. Under international pressure, Kagame arrested Nkunda. But instead of extraditing him to the DRC, he placed him under house arrest in Rwanda, ensuring he remained silent. The CNDP was integrated into the Congolese army, but Rwanda's influence didn't stop here. By 2012, a new rebellion emerged in eastern Congo, known as the March 23 movement. This group was made up of former CNDP fighters who had been integrated into the Congolese army but defected, claiming that the government had failed to honor a 2009 peace agreement. Once again, the UN and human rights groups exposed Rwanda's deep involvement in this crisis. The evidence was quite overwhelming. Rwanda provided weapons, recruits, and logistical support to M23. Rwandan troops were seen fighting alongside M23 rebels in North Kivu province. M23 leaders coordinated with Rwandan military officials who dictated their attacks and strategies. According to a 2012 UN report, Rwanda was directly implicated in this crisis, revealing that Kagame's government was the main sponsor of M23. The rebels were accused of terrorizing civilians, committing massacres, rapes, and the forced recruitment of child soldiers. The city of Goma fell briefly under M23 control, with some people forced to flee. For the first time, Kagame faced real diplomatic consequences. The United States and the United Kingdom temporarily suspended military aid to Rwanda. But these measures were short-lived, and by 2013, international pressure forced Rwanda to back down. M23 was defeated and its leaders fled, allegedly to Rwanda. But Kagame's government never handed them over to the DRC. Instead, they were quietly housed in Rwandan territory, waiting for the next war. By 2021, eastern Congo was still unstable. The Congolese army was stretched thin, and new militias were rising. This presented another opportunity for this Rwandan-backed rebel group to restart their operation in eastern DRC. In 2022, M23 re-emerged, launching fresh attacks on Congolese towns. Once again, the UN, human rights organizations, and independent investigations provided clear evidence of Rwandan support, but Kagame's government denied involvement yet again. The Congolese government even openly accused Rwanda of invading its territory under the cover of a proxy rebellion. African leaders tried to mediate, but Kagame showed no signs of backing down. Meanwhile, Western governments again have largely remained silent. Rwanda continued receiving aid, and Kagame presented himself as a regional peacekeeper. His troops were even deployed on international peacekeeping missions, earning him credibility while his forces continued to destabilize the DRC. Despite decades of evidence proving Rwanda's role in fueling war in the DRC, Kagame remains a favorite of Western governments. But the big question is, why? The honest answer to that question we might never know. But some have said this could be as a result of guilt. Many Western leaders feel guilty for failing to stop the Rwandan genocide. Kagame has skillfully used this to silence criticism, portraying himself as Rwanda's savior who deserves unwavering support. And this blackmail seems to have worked. There are also strategic interests to think about. Rwanda is a key partner for the US and European nations in military operations in Africa. Kagame's troops participate in UN and African Union missions, which gives him some diplomatic leverage. And the man Kagame himself has built an effective propaganda machine, branding himself as a progressive leader while silencing journalists and opposition voices. Kagame's government now openly sponsors European businesses in efforts considered to be an attempt to whitewash his records back at home. Yeah, when you turn to the Premier League, you'll see clubs like Arsenal wearing adverts for Rwanda. Western media often portray Rwanda as a development success story, ignoring its darker roles in regional conflicts. As of 2024, M23 continues to fight in eastern Congo, displacing thousands of people. Kagame denies involvement, while the international community offers little more than empty statements. Now, the question is, when will this end?